Welcome to our tutorial about the Storm Terrain System. The Storm Terrain System takes default Unity terrains as input and allows you to use advanced rendering features such as mesh blending, dynamic snow, and more. Before we get started with the tutorial, please notice that Storm comes with a lot of offline information that might help you if you're stuck. You can find the Storm user guide and additional documents in the Procedural Worlds folder of your installation. Also, most of Storm's user interface features a question mark icon that allows you to view help texts that explain the functionality of each element on the screen. Likewise, you can also hover the mouse over entries to see a help text popping up. But let's get into the video now. In order to produce the same output as shown in the video, you will need the following: an HDRP project running Storm, and a terrain with some textures on it. In this video, we will use a terrain made with Gaia, but any Unity terrain with textures on it will work as well. Before you start, please make sure that you have saved your scene so that it has a unique name that will make it easier to identify the data for this scene later. You can add the terrain system to your scene by opening the Storm Terrain Manager window. You can do this either via window Procedural Worlds, Storm Terrain Manager, or from the Storm Plugins tab in the Storm Manager. Click on the Ingest Storm Terrain button to start the ingestion process. The terrain system will collect information from the terrains in the scene and will create a new Storm Terrain game object in the scene. If you happen to use a scene that uses a terrain loading setup from Gaia, the Storm Terrain system will process all terrains from this world automatically. During the ingestion process, it will create a Storm Terrain game object in the scene. It will also create configuration files in the folder Storm User Data, Terrain, and then in a subfolder named after your scene. The configuration files hold settings and information about the terrains and the textures used in the terrain layers that were ingested. In the Storm Terrain Manager window, you can choose which Storm Terrain mode you want to use. In Unity Terrain mode, the original Unity terrains will stay active in the scene, and Storm will only perform the rendering of the terrains. In clipmap mode, the system is not dependent on the original terrains anymore. Those can be deactivated or even removed from the scene. The long-term goal for the clipmap mode is to be completely independent of the Unity terrain system during runtime. The clipmap mode is, however, still in an early state and is not considered production ready yet. It can be used in smaller scenes, but does not work well in larger environments. For the purpose of this tutorial, please leave the system in the Unity terrain mode for now. While the scene is not in play mode, the terrain system will not be active. Please make sure the terrain system picked up the correct main game camera for the scene in the Storm Terrain game object, and then start the scene. During runtime, the terrain system starts to render the terrain in your scene. You can access the features of the terrain system through the Terrain Manager window. Global features that will apply to the system as a whole can be found on the Features tab. Here you can find controls for things like the dynamic snow or height blending. For more information on the individual features, please use the question mark icon or check the manual document for the terrain system. Settings that are individual to each terrain texture or layer can be found on the Terrain Layers tab. Here you can access a list of terrain layers in your world. If you select one of those, you can toggle individual features that apply to this layer only. In there, you can find settings like macro variation or adding puddles to a texture. As with the global features, you can find more information about the individual settings in the help texts and the manual document. Note that with both the global and the local features, that the changes you make will stay even when you exit play mode. This means you can tweak and tune the settings for the terrain system directly in the running project. The terrain system comes with an imposter shader that you can utilize on mesh impostors, such as the ones created by Gaia, for the purpose of displaying distant terrains. It expects a diffuse color texture that represents the terrain texturing and a terrain normal map. If you create the impostors with the help of Gaia, you can directly assign this shader in the Terrain Converter window. With this shader on the impostors, the dynamic snow feature of the terrain system will then also affect the distant imposter terrains. A feature that is not directly visible, but very useful, is that the terrain system supports up to 16 layers on a single terrain, unlike the default Unity shader that allows only 8. This allows for more complex layer setups on the terrain. The system reads in the splat map information from the original terrain data objects. This means you can still edit the texturing, and this will be reflected when the system is running. The system can also, to a degree, recognize new layers that are being added to the Unity terrains while you are editing the scene. It can happen, however, that the terrain system is not in sync with the Unity terrains anymore, for example if the layers were changed by an update that was pulled in from source control. In this case, this new layer will not render correctly during runtime. To fix this, you can run the command regenerate data for scene from the Terrain Manager window. This command will allow you also to pick up new terrains that have been added since the initial ingestion happened. The terrain system has blending features that allow you to blend meshes and decals into the terrain. This allows for a more natural look for things like tree stumps, rocks, fallen trees, etc., but can also look interesting on man-made objects as well, if you want to give them a slight overgrown look. To use mesh blending, you can use a special shader that comes with the terrain system. You can use the Litstorm Blend HDRP shader in HDRP and likewise the Litstorm Blend URP in URP. This shader features settings for blending the textures of the terrain onto the mesh, and also skirting, which allows you to automatically align the mesh with the terrain shape. This can be extremely useful if your mesh features a ground plate. The shader already works with the Storm object rendering, so you can also use it in features that use spawn and render through Storm as well. If you want to adapt your own shaders to use mesh blending and skirting, please take a look at the shader graph. It also serves as an example for how to integrate the custom nodes into your own graphs. The terrain system can also bake meshes and decals into the terrain. Meshes will appear flat on the terrain surface without rendering the actual object anymore. This allows you to use decals on the terrain system and to render objects like roads on the terrain surface without worrying about issues like z-fighting. For baking objects into the terrain, you can attach the script Storm VT decal to the object. Depending on whether it is a mesh or a decal, the script will automatically select the right decal type. When you run the scene, the object will then be rendered as part of the terrain surface. The baked content will also be taken into account for the mesh blending we went over in the previous chapter. By combining blended meshes with baked decals, you can create detail-rich environments where the user cannot tell the difference between terrains and meshes anymore. The road decal type is a special baking mode for spline-based meshes, similar to the ones created by the GNA road system. The road will be rendered as part of the terrain surface as well, and you will have special blending options available that allow you to nicely blend the sides of the road with the terrain. Another feature that the terrain system supports is vegetation color baking. If you use Gaia to create imposter terrains, you can choose to bake color information from the storm vegetation into separate textures. Those color textures can then be used in the terrain system to represent vegetation in the distance. This is, however, an advanced topic that exceeds the scope of this video. We will cover this in another tutorial in the future. Until then, you can find instructions on how to set this up in the Terrain System User Guide. That concludes our tutorial on the Storm Terrain System. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.